Okay, well, welcome everybody. So glad that you could all come and listen to our guest, David Hartsough, a very, very special guest. And I'm going to introduce him first. Uh, this will be about a 45-minute or so interview, and I could spend, I could spend an hour introducing David. I'm going to keep it short. He's one of the great peace leaders of our time. He would never say that because he's very humble and modest, but the fact is he is one of the great peace leaders of our time. We won't have time to cover everything that he has accomplished. He wrote an amazing book called Waging Peace that, and the subtitle is Adventures of a Lifelong Activist.
Global Adventures of a Lifelong Activist.
Global Adventures of a Lifelong Activist. And I highly recommend, I'm going to use this book in my courses. I highly recommend that you get this book. There's also an illustrated audio book that I had the honor of impersonating David, speaking the words. That is also available through the Institute for Social Justice at Union, which is sponsoring this event. So I won't go on and on and on about David because we don't have time, but there's sure is a lot more I could say. But let me start first by saying, David, thank you so much for joining us.
Welcome.
I wanted to first ask you about a sort of a more philosophical question about nonviolence. A new book just came out, and I don't know if you've heard about it, called Nonviolence Before King.
No, I don't know it.
Published by University of North Carolina Press by Anthony Siracusa. And the subtitle is The Politics of Being and the Black Freedom Struggle. And one of his main points, which I wanted you to maybe speak briefly about, is that he sees nonviolence as, among other things, apart from the impact on the world and all the rest, that it has, if it's done right, if it's done the way you do it, that it has a way of changing the person, changing the activist who engages in it, and really helping that person to not only grow, but to kind of become their higher self, to really become a more powerful person, so that a lot of what appealed to especially the early civil rights activists, the lunch counter sit-ins and so forth, was that from James Lawson, their tutor, Reverend James Lawson, who taught them about nonviolent direct action in the workshops in Nashville, Tennessee, was that this was a way that they could change themselves. This is the way they could better themselves as individuals. And Siracusa calls this the politics of being. I just wonder if you had any reflection on that.
Well, I think that the people that got involved in Montgomery, and then the people that got involved in the sit-in movement, and certainly the freedom rides and the voting rights movement, I discovered the power of nonviolence as a means to try to challenge injustice and segregation in our society, but also found a different way of living and relating to each other. And there was a sense of community. And later in the movement for New Society, we called it living the revolution, as well as working for it in the larger society. And I think that nonviolence is both a way of living and of being and of relating to one another and to the environment. And it's also a means of struggle, and is Gandhi said it's the most powerful force in the world. And I think we found out in the freedom movement in the 60s, 70s the 1960s and 70s. We can't say this century. That we found out what a powerful force it was. And obviously the work is not done, but
Right.
anyway, I resonate with what you said
Right.
about the transformation in people's lives that were part of the struggle. And there was something in it that actually encouraged us to keep struggling, even though the police are there with their fire hoses and police dogs and batons. This is no reason to give up.
Right. Great. Good. I just thought that would be a good way to get us started. Could you talk to us maybe briefly about some of the early influences on your life, especially your parents, your father and your mother? I know a lot about your life because not only have I read your book, but I've spoken your book. But just something about the influence of your father and your mother.
Well, my dad was a congregational pastor, and we lived in Ohio and Iowa when I was growing up. And this was during the Second World War. And Dad believed what Jesus said about loving one another and loving your enemy. And who is my neighbor? The Good Samaritan story.
Right.
And so when he was asked to join the military as a chaplain and essentially bless other soldiers as they go out and kill people, he felt he could not do that. And that, so he was a conscience objector, but continued to have churches in small towns in Ohio. And that wasn't always popular. And there were actually some movements to get him out of the church. But then others said, well, we hired Reverend Hartsough to speak the word of God as he understands it. And, but at any rate, and then my dad, when I was 8 years old, 1940, December of 48, after the first Israeli-Palestinian war, was asked by the American Friends Service Committee to go and help administer relief to the Palestinian refugees in Gaza. And that was seen as a pretty dangerous assignment. There was still fighting going on, and here were millions of people that had no food or tents or medical supplies. And I had heard my dad give a lot of good sermons about who was my neighbor, and he just felt led to accept that invitation and went for 9 months and was in charge of a refugee camp, getting food and medicine and tents to, I forget, but thousands of refugees. And that made a very great impact on me, that he was not only giving good sermons in church, but he really believed this and was willing to put his life on the line for people that, he'd never been out of the United States before that. That we really are a global human family, and that love is not just for people in your own family, but for all people who are also children of God. So that certainly had a great influence on me. And then my mother when Congress was first deciding to vote for universal military conscription. And it ended after the Second World War. But
Could you
then,
speak a little louder, David, because your voice
you don't
suddenly
hear?
cracked. Yeah.
There was legislation to start the universal military training, the collective service system. And my mother, with others, went to Washington and fasted for a week, encouraging Congress to say no to this. This didn't seem in keeping with a country that wanted to live at peace with the world. And so that certainly had an influence. And then my parents gave me the book called All Men Are Brothers. And I think Gandhi would have said now, all people are brothers and sisters. But, and each of those sentences was an inspiration. So anyway, that was very, very important. And then when I was, 14 or so, Ralph Abernathy, who was working with Martin Luther King, my dad organized a speaking tour for him to share about the Montgomery bus boycott, and then came to our home and said this was the first white home he'd ever slept in. But so he then he said to my dad, he says, Ray, why don't you bring the boys down to Montgomery and find out what we're doing down there? So we went down there on our spring vacation in 1956. And that was my first introduction to nonviolent, active nonviolence by thousands of people who were courageous, courageously walking to work instead of riding the buses on a segregated basis. And when Black churches were bombed, instead of saying, okay, we're going to go and bomb some white churches, saying, well, we're going to try to love these people instead of hating. Hate begets hate. But anyway, so that was meeting Martin Luther King and spending time with Ralph Abernathy and the people in that freedom. The Montgomery bus boycott was just very important for me.
So let's jump ahead. You started out, your parents wanted you to go to Swarthmore College, but you wanted to go to Howard University, one of the leading historically Black colleges and universities. And so you made an agreement with them that you would, you'd go to Skidmore for 1 year and then you decided that you would transfer to Howard. And this must have been in the fall of 1959, I would guess.
Yeah.
Something like that. And you got involved with a small group of I guess, mostly Black students who were going to be part of the sit-in movement of 1960. And so you and that group decided that you were going to desegregate a lunch counter in Arlington, Virginia. Could you tell us a little about that?
Well, when the 4 students in Greensboro, North Carolina, decided that they had to actually do something to challenge segregation in the South, when they were arrested, actually the next Saturday after that, a group of us from Howard started picketing the Woolworths drugstore. And that went on for a while. And then we thought, well, we discovered that all the eating facilities in both Maryland and Virginia surrounding Washington, D.C. were still segregated. So we started going to Maryland, sitting down at lunch counters on Saturday mornings usually, and were arrested. Spent the weekends in jail. not feeling sorry for ourselves, but singing freedom songs and, getting to, building our sense of community and caring about each other and about the struggle. And the state of Virginia had passed a law saying you can get 6 months in jail and a $500 fine for challenging the segregation laws there. And so most of the spring, we kept going to Maryland, where it was a weekend rather than 6 months and $500 fines. And the American Nazi Party was also located in Northern Virginia, and threatening violence against anybody that challenged the segregation laws there. So we did some additional nonviolence training and went to a People's Drugstore in Arlington, Virginia. And the owner apparently did not want the publicity, so he did not arrest us, but he also didn't give us anything to eat. So we sat there for 2 days waiting for something to eat and got pretty hungry and thirsty. And it was the most challenging 2 days of my life because people, including the people from the Nazi Party with their swastikas, and came in and spat at us in the face, put lit cigarettes down our shirts, punched us in the stomach so hard that we would fall on the floor, and then they would kick us. And each time something like this would happen, we would try to respond in a nonviolent, loving way that, looking not so much at the hatred that they were espousing, but at the trying to touch the humanity in them. And so anyway, toward the end of the second day, I'd been reading a little bit from the New Testament on loving your enemies. And a guy came up from behind me and he said, you get out of this door in 2 seconds or I'm going to stab this through your heart. And in his hand was a switchblade. And when I had 2 seconds to decide, do I really believe in nonviolence, or is there some other way that I could respond to this guy? And we'd had a lot of practice, and I looked at him in the eye and I said, well, friend, do what you believe is right, but I'll still try to love you. And it was kind of a miracle. His face that was contorted with hatred, his jaw began to drop, and his hand that was with a knife was literally a ½ inch from my heart began to drop, and he left the store. So at the age of 20, it was the power of nonviolence in relating to even a very, very hateful person. But then we did something even more challenging. There were about 500 people outside with rocks and threatening violence. And we wrote a statement and went to the front door of this People's Drugstore and appealed to the religious and community leaders to use their influence to get the eating facilities open to everyone. And then this was the hard part. We said, if nothing changes in a week, we'll be back. And some friendly media people got us out alive. And we went back to Howard and literally shook for 6 days whether we had the courage to go back and do this again. And on the 6th day, we got a phone call that the religious and community leaders had met and had talked with the business leaders and got a commitment to open the eating facilities in Arlington for within 10 days. So I consider that as the most important lesson of my life, that when something that's terrible is happening, there's a lot of terrible things happening instead of just cursing the television set or the president or segregation or wars, you find some other people that believe as deeply as you do, get some nonviolent training and go out and challenge it.
And it showed that nonviolent direct action really works,
Yes.
really works. So I'd like to jump ahead a bit. You had the opportunity to study in Berlin and I believe also in Russia for a while, and you had various trips that you took, and those were all very eye-opening for you, and you learned that the Russians and the Americans they each were just some of the ones you talked to were, equally dogmatic about, communists or capitalists being evil, but that you got a sense of them as, human beings, as good human beings. And then in early 1962, maybe it was April or May, you had an opportunity to join a Quaker group from American Friends Service Committee, Quaker group, activist group, that was able to make an appointment with President Kennedy in the Oval Office. And I wonder if you could tell us about what happened at that meeting and what you think a possible effect of that might have been.
Well, most of the people were quite, middle-aged, older, respectable folks. And I was this young, barely 22-year-old college student.
I think if you could be a little louder, maybe moving the.
Yeah, there's.
Yeah, good.
Okay.
Good.
But at any rate, Kennedy invited us into the Oval Office, and we were sitting in a circle. And what impressed me most was he was willing to just listen. It was not, I'm the president of the United States. I'm going to tell you what's really happening. He listened, and we were sharing our concern about the nuclear arms race. We're concerned about the starvation that was happening in China. We were concerned about a nuclear submarine that was, loaded with nuclear weapons that was going to be called the William Penn. And when we shared that concern, he said, I will see that doesn't happen. And we challenged him to, or encouraged him to challenge the Russians to a peace race. We'd been having an arms race where we have nuclear weapons, and then they get nuclear weapons, and then we get bigger nuclear weapons, and they get bigger nuclear weapons. And instead of an arms race, why don't we have a peace race? We can stop our nuclear bomb testing, then they will stop their nuclear bomb testing, and then we can reduce our military budget, and they reduce their military budget, et cetera. Well, he said several things. He said, I've been studying, or I've just been reading The Guns of August before the First World War, and everybody was arming to the teeth to try to get security and forming military alliances, and in order to try to get security. And that was exactly what got them all into the war. Everybody was preparing for war, hoping for peace. And anyway, he said, it's really scary how similar that situation was to what it was now in 1962, not knowing that the Cuban Missile Crisis was going to be a few months later. But then he said, if you're serious about this, you're going to have to build a much stronger movement to help encourage me to take this kind of leadership, because the military industrial complex that Eisenhower warned about is very strong. And well, he said, anyway, we both went away with a commitment. He had really, after about 30 minutes, his secretary came in to tell him his next appointment was there. And he said, tell them to wait. I'm learning something from these Quakers. So that was pretty affirming. And we had our marching orders, so to speak. We've got to go out and help organize a movement that is going to challenge the military industrial complex.
Now tell us about the food for starving people in China.
Well, as I said, there was, massive famine in China, and the United States was storing grain in silos in, I think, Kansas. And taxpayers were paying for that, for storage. And we said, well, why don't we take this grain and this food and send it to China? And he said, you mean we should feed the enemy? And we said, yes, that's exactly what we mean. They are human beings also. And people have a right to, or have a need to feed their children. So as far as the impact, by early 1963, which was, after the Cuba Missile Crisis, Kennedy's national security advisors were urging over and over again to increase the arms race. And on a whole series of actions, he refused the advice of the national security advisors and really took very courageous steps to move toward away from this kind of nuclear confrontation and toward really supporting a peaceful resolution of conflicts. And Jim Douglas has written a book, JFK and the Unspeakable, why he died, how he died, and why it matters. Feels that we actually had an important influence on him in terms of giving the kind of leadership that was needed to move us away from this horrendous arms race. And Jim Douglas feels that because Kennedy was taking this kind of courageous leadership, that could well have led to that military-industrial complex in the military and the CIA, et cetera, to help and get him assassinated.
And I'm convinced of that myself. And
yeah, I am too.
I've read that book very carefully. I'm a historian. If anybody has any doubts about what we're saying, it's called JFK and the Unspeakable by James Douglas. And one of the things that Kennedy did was the limited nuclear test ban treaty, which again, his advisors were opposed to. He pushed that through. He pushed that through in the summer of 1963. He also, I found this out recently doing some research, he also did give wheat to the Soviet Union.
To the Chinese?
Give wheat.
I'm not hearing you, Stewart. Uh-oh. Stewart, have you frozen?
Be about first how the Ukrainians could have engaged in some kind of nonviolent action, or what you think they could have done differently or could be doing differently to defend their nation. And then secondly, what we as Americans or outsiders around the world, what could we be doing to besides sending money and so forth. One of my colleagues at the Union Institute is actually spending the month in Poland because she's an immigrant from Russia. Poland, helping with the refugee centers, doing whatever, translations and all sorts of things. But what do you think Ukrainians could be doing possibly to reduce the violence and move toward peace talks? And then secondly, what we as Americans possibly could, I know these are impossible questions, but if anyone can shed light on them, you can.
Well, the Ukrainians in 2004, when they had the elections that were fraudulent elections, the hundreds of thousands of people demonstrated in the freezing cold in the winter and demanded a new election that the real winner of that election should be won. And it was totally nonviolent. And they were out there day and night in the freezing cold for weeks. And it was when some people had encouraged them to kind of march to the presidential palace and have a really a violent confrontation, they said, no, we're going to be nonviolent. And the people won. The man who had really won that election became the president. Well, in 2014, there was another fraudulent election. Any rate, not to go into depth about that, but I think Gene Sharp has written about nonviolent civilian-based defense, that governments only, or invaders or dictators, only have power if the people will abide by what that dictator or the attacker wants people to do. If people have decided that they're not going to cooperate, the power of the the dictator, the invader, disappears. Well, I think that if the Ukrainians had remembered about what they had done in 2004 in saying no to this guy who tried to hold on to the election and said, instead of fighting, with arms, with tanks and all this military hardware that the US and other NATO countries had been arming Ukraine for years, preparing for this. But if instead of that, the people had been training for total non-cooperation if the Russians invade, and if they had been able to actually practice that, I think even if the Russians had the troops had invaded the country and militarily occupied it, but the people wouldn't cooperate and treated the Russian soldiers as human beings who had children and families and didn't want to be out killing innocent people who were actually their fellow men, their fellow Slavic peoples. And this happened in Czechoslovakia in 1968, where the government ordered the troops to stay in their barracks, not to fight the Soviet troops. And I mean, there were things did happen, like people changed road signs, and there were examples of just people unarmed standing in front of tanks and holding them back with a whole line of tanks behind them. It was very similar to Tiananmen Square. I mean, the morale of the Russian soldiers, if they had not been faced with people that were trying to shoot them before they could shoot them, it would have been a totally different dynamic. And as far as what the U.S. and the West could do, instead of sending billions of dollars worth of arms, and we're sending more and more every day, I think that if we continue the way we are, this war, and the people in the Pentagon are saying this war could continue for a long, long time. Well, the US could be saying, instead of a negotiated settlement, 6 months from now, or a year from now, or 20 years from now, like Afghanistan, let's push for a negotiated settlement now. Otherwise, it's the Ukrainian people that are going to pay the price. And both sides are kind of acting like we will fight till the last Ukrainian has been killed. I mean, the alternative to a negotiated settlement is more and more death and destruction. So actually, the armaments that we're sending over there are in a very real sense are prolonging the war. And if instead we put all the pressure that we could to support a negotiated settlement, which would include a commitment that Ukraine would not be neutral, or would not be a part of any military alliance, East or West, and would be neutral, militarily, politically. And that was a key demand of Russia before. Right. And I believe that the constant the constant showing day after day, night after night, the killing that's going on has whipped up a war fever in the United States, which could very easily get us into a full-scale war and even a nuclear war. And it's just luck we have not had a nuclear war already. Right. And people like the Union of Concerned Scientists are saying the doomsday clock is 100 seconds to midnight. And it's more dangerous now than any time since the Second World War.
Do you think it might be a good idea? Do you think it might make sense for Americans to try to organize a movement to our own government demanding that Ukraine not join NATO, which is what Zelensky has already said, that he's willing to give that up, but the United States may have veto power over that. A campaign to get the U.S. government to not insist that Ukraine join NATO, and also that Ukraine become a neutral country. Do you think, with the Biden administration and with at least the more progressive Democrats in Congress, do you think a movement of that kind, a nonviolent movement of that kind, in the various ways that we do it, could that have an impact on, because the United States in some ways is calling the shots. The United States Biden could end this war immediately if he were willing to declare that Ukraine would never join NATO and would be a neutral country. Do you think it might help if people in the United States were demanding that, en masse as protest?
I think that's absolutely critical, and that is what is needed. And there are going to be demonstrations all over the world on Saturday, the 7th of May, and then on Saturday, the 25th of June, saying no to the war in Ukraine, Russian troops get out, and no to NATO. And we had promised Gorbachev, I mean, the US and other Western nations, that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward.
That's right.
And now we're on their borders.
We're circling
and doing
them.
military exercises.
We've encircled them.
And there's almost no acknowledgement in the US established media or by our politicians that we had a role in helping cause this war.
A big
And
role. Big role.
I think we have to move from the idea of national security, and we thought it was in our national interest to expand NATO to 15 new countries right on the Russian border, to shared security. What's going to be the security for everybody? And to put ourselves in the other person's shoes. What if Russia or China developed a military alliance with Mexico and Canada? And says, well, this is just for security. We don't mean anything against the United States. We saw in the Cuban Missile Crisis when the Soviet Union put nuclear missiles in Cuba, we were ready to go to nuclear war to get them out of there, because that was a threat to our security. So we have to, we almost have an addiction to violence as a way of resolving conflict and threatening and wars. And I mean, as you know, we spend unlimited billions, trillions for armaments, but we say we don't have the money to improve our schools or to cancel student debt or to help prevent future pandemics like COVID, or to make the transition to a renewable energy world. That would have a whole lot more difference in terms of security for the American people and the people of all the world than, you know, additional trillions of dollars modernizing our nuclear weapons and playing nuclear roulette is what we're doing.
Well, that's a great segue to the last question, because I know you have to leave. And this has been a fabulous, fabulous discussion, and I've certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure other people have too. One of the main themes of the Institute for Social Justice at Union Institute University is to create one just world. That's sort of our motto, you know, one just world. And I wonder if you could just, in a few words, tell us what you started to just a minute ago, if you could tell us sort of what your vision might be of one just world, a just world, what it might look like.
Well, as I mentioned, I think to really think in terms of national security, look at shared security for all peoples and all nations. And not that we're going to, our security at somebody else's, at somebody else's expense. I think with something like 3% of US military budget, we could end hunger in the whole world.
That's right.
We could have tens of thousands of Peace Corps people all over the world helping develop medical clinics, and we could be putting billions of dollars into hundreds of billions of dollars into helping not only ourselves, but the whole world make the transition to a renewable energy world. So we're not going to have the climate disaster, which lies ahead of us if we stay addicted to fossil fuels. We could have, I mean, even now, I mean, COVID knows nothing about national borders. And to say, well, we have vaccines for the American people, but, you know, if whatever it is, 80 to 90% of the people in Africa and many parts of Asia, you know, there's no vaccination. Well, and even within the United States, the poor counties throughout this country have a much higher level of people dying from COVID. It's because of lack of health care.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you can't say COVID, don't come away into our county. We're one of the richer counties. Uh, it's a world where we really are concerned about the value of every human being, that every person deserves to have dignity, has the right to send their children to a good school, has access to medical care. We could afford all of that if we didn't continue to squander our money on preparing for ever more wars. And we have seen through Vietnam, through Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, our trillions of dollars have not gotten us security. And maybe it's time to really look at a radically different way of how we do get security, and really seeing ourselves as a human family, not Americans versus Russians versus Chinese versus
And
all the other guys.
David has also done a lot of work, I'm sure he could talk about a great deal, on nonviolent civilian defense. And a lot of people have worked on nonviolent civilian defense, and it's very well developed, and it's something that I think that we need to really pursue, so that if there were conflicts, that we would have an infrastructure already in place to prevent these wars, or to deal with these wars nonviolently instead of violently. So David, this has been an incredible interview. Oh,
this is a book that the World Beyond War has put together called A Global Security System and Alternative to War.
Oh, terrific, terrific.
So I highly recommend this,
Terrific.
as well as the book by Gene Sharp on the nonviolent civilian-based defense.
Great.
Look, I need to run, but it's great talking with you, Stewart.
And David, I just want to say that I hope everyone will go out and get your book, Waging Peace, Lifelong Adventures of a Nonviolent Activist.
Global Adventures of a Lifelong Activist.
Global Adventures of a Nonviolent Activist, Waging Peace by David Hartsough, published by PM Press. Fabulous book, memoir. And also, if you prefer to listen to it, it's also available as a illustrated audiobook through the Institute for Social Justice. But you can order it through Amazon. You can go to YouTube to do the illustrated audiobook. And thank you so much, everybody, for listening. This has been so important. David, you're just a magnificent human being, a role model for all of us. And we're so grateful to have the opportunity to talk with you and to hear all the wisdom that you have to share with us.
Thank you, Stewart, and great to talk with all of you.
Great. Okay, we'll be in touch.
Bye-bye.
Take care.